All right, starting the broadcast. In the TC Dojo open session today, we are lucky to have Alyssa Fox with us as our visiting dojo master. Alyssa is the Director of Information Development and Program Management at Micro Focus in Houston, Texas. Her interests and skills include technical communication, user experience, process improvement, project management, and agile development practices. She recently ended her time as the STC Secretary because she's going to be the VP next year. You asked for a session on Agile and you've got it. In fact, you couldn't have anyone better here to talk. No matter who you ask, if you want to learn about Agile, Alyssa's name is always at the top of the list. And I'm thrilled she agreed to be our visiting TC Dojo master today. She said she will take questions as we go, so be sure to type them in the question window. And if you want to ask your question directly, just put it in there and I'll unmute you when she reaches her next natural break. All right, Alyssa, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you. Show your screen.
All right, can you see it?
I can, and it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Liz. I'm really honored to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone out there, wherever you might be in the world. Talking about Agile and TechComm is one of my favorite things because I believe that Agile really provides a lot of benefit to technical communicators. There are some things that I'm going to talk about today that are probably common myths or misconceptions about Agile and how a writer might work in there. So I felt like addressing some of that and the top 5 things you need to know about Agile and TechComm would be a great direction to head down today. So I mentioned the benefits of Agile to writers. There are many different benefits that writers can see from using an Agile software development environment, but I tried to pick the top 3. So first of all, it expands your role on your team. If you are participating in an Agile environment, particularly Scrum or some similar flavor of Agile, you're going to see that it really lends itself toward making the writers equal members of the team, the project teams. So everything is not depending on when the development work is done or when the testing work is done. It's dependent on when the development, testing, and documentation work is done. So it gives us an expanded role there. It improves the quality of our documentation deliverables through the way that we are going to write the doc, get the doc reviewed, and make sure that we're in those sprints and user stories along with development and testing. And finally, if you're doing Agile in a way that makes sense and builds on the previous 2 bullets, then it's going to help you avoid most of the end of the release cycle crunch that you find when you're doing waterfall development. With waterfall development, you're typically going through a design and then coding, then testing, the documentation phase. And we tend to get pretty bogged down at the end of the release where everybody's breathing down our necks to kind of finish up the doc, finish up the doc. But Agile helps you actually write all the way along the path. And so it's not nearly as crunched at the end. So the first thing I want to talk about is the definition of done versus done. So typically in a waterfall environment, you kind of have a siloed setup with development doing one thing, testing doing another thing, and documentation doing a final thing. So generally, if you're working in silos, then the whole team won't have the same vision of what you're building. Sometimes testing and documentation will lag behind development, and the functional areas will not all be working together as a single team to get all those user stories coded, tested, and documented within the same sprint. So generally what that leads to is calling user stories done versus done. And what people mean by that is when the development work is done, the user story is done, and then once the testing and doc are also complete, then they call it done. Well, aside from done sounding totally ridiculous, it's not a valid concept within a whole team approach of Agile. So you need to make sure that those silos are broken down. You move towards having one definition of done, and that includes the coding, testing, and documentation stories, or documentation tasks, all within that story to have it done at the end of the sprint. That way, the entire team is accepting responsibility for completing all aspects of each user story. And the user story is complete and potentially shippable, which we'll talk about a little bit later, by the end of that sprint. So the lesson that we can learn here is that we need to use the whole team approach and ensure that you are an equal member of the team. Not only does that help you with your estimates, making sure that your estimates are included in the overall project estimates, it helps you with your visibility with the team, it helps the entire team with getting actual potentially shippable code and, potentially shippable product and documentation at the end of the sprint, and it obviously improves teamwork and communication among all the team members. The next thing that Agile gives writers is much more thorough technical reviews. So I would expect that most of the people on this call, if not everybody, sends their documentation through some sort of technical review with their project stakeholders. Typically that can include developers, testers, it can include your product managers or product owners, sometimes your support people, and even your field people like sales engineers. Obviously, the more thorough technical review we get from the experts or the SMEs, the better our documentation is and the more useful it will be to our customers. So the way that we handle this on my team is that we write the doc for a feature in the sprint in which it's developed and tested. We consider that the first draft of the doc. So in order to do that and be able to track it and make sure that it actually happens, we have tasks inside the user story for writing the documentation, having a developer or tester review the documentation, and then the writer actually applying the edits to the documentation. Now, if you're doing this for chunks of documentation within a sprint, you're going to find that you're sending much smaller pieces of content out for review versus sending a 200-page book towards the end of the release. You're going to be sending out maybe a couple of pages, maybe even a couple of paragraphs, depending on the user story that you're documenting. What that does is, as we spread the documentation review throughout the release cycle, that gives everybody an opportunity to provide a more thorough review because they're not overwhelmed by the volume of the content that you're sending them, as well as them being a little more, that topic is more top of mind with the reviewer because you're working on it right then. You're writing and reviewing the doc for a feature at the same time the feature is being coded and tested. So people are already working on that area in the product and the content that goes along with it. And then you can have the option of sending out a full book later in the release cycle just to kind of give people some context about where those previous snippets of doc that you've already sent out and gotten reviewed fit into an overall structure or information architecture. So you'll see the combination of all those different pieces of documentation that you've sent out. So the advantages of this approach, of course, means that you're going to get more thorough reviews for your doc. Anytime you are, let's say, out on the web and looking at a website, if you can read a couple of paragraphs and get the information that you need, and then another website has about 4 pages of content, I would venture to say that most likely you're going to go for the couple of paragraphs. People just tend to gravitate towards smaller chunks of content, and so you're going to get a little more thorough reviews from people because they're more willing to read and review a couple of paragraphs than an entire book at one time. The other thing is when you're sending out only a full book at the end of a release cycle, that's most likely the time that your developers and testers are super busy trying to do bug fixing and testing of those bug fixes. So they don't have as much time to give you to review the doc. So often what happens then is you might send something out, you get a couple of comments back that says, hey, looks good. You know, typically those come in about 5 minutes later when you know they haven't read the 200 pages, but they just don't have time to fit that in with the other work that they're doing. So having it staggered throughout the release cycle is a huge advantage and definitely leads towards getting that higher quality review. So that, of course, leads to the doc being more technically accurate, the quality is better, there's more specific information in there for the users, and what's more useful to our customers. The other internal advantage of this is that the team members' needed capacity for an approval draft is reduced. So you don't have to put so much effort towards the end of the sprint, towards the end of the release to putting out a giant 200-page book. It's simply a matter of compiling the previous things that you've done.
We have a question.
Sure.
We have 2 questions, actually. One question says, in my experience, I get a lot less tech review in Agile because it's considered off the books time.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that?
Okay, so let me go to my next slide and I can answer that. So I would advise that you're actually including your documentation tasks and their reviews within the user stories alongside those coding and testing tasks. So I assume it's considered off the books because it's either not being tracked in your Agile tracking tool for the writer and or the reviewer. So when we first started doing this, the reviewers would tell us, oh no, we don't need to put time in the Agile tracking tool for making that review because we'll just have time to do it. We know that we're going to have time to do it. Well, of course, what happens, and that would be considered off the books, right? what ended up happening is the writer would put our time in there for writing the doc and sending it out. Then inevitably, because the reviewers did not allow time in their capacity, which we'll talk about in a minute, to actually review the doc, it never happened. So you have to make it visible. You have to put it on the books and say, you know what, part of having this user story done is to have it coded, tested, documented, reviewed, and edits applied. Otherwise, the user story is not done. So all of that work has to be put on the books. Hopefully that helps.
It does. So there's a follow-up question. So that I'm guessing that means you put the doc tasks inside the dev stories rather than as separate stories.
Yes, we do.
Okay. We got one more follow-up. It's tracked under doc time, not dev time in most places, and not considered in dev people estimation. Is that just an effort you have to convince them to do?
Okay. So if you're putting your documentation tasks in the same user story with the dev and QE tasks, there's not going to be a delineation for that user story between dev and doc. We actually put the task in there and obviously the writing the doc task is assigned to the writer. The reviewing the doc task is then assigned to either a developer or tester, whatever your team decides to do. So all of those tasks, though, are in the same user stories, along with the tasks for coding the feature and the things involved in the user story and testing it. So it's a dev task to review the doc, but it's within the user story with all the other tasks. I hope that clarifies some.
I think so. There's one other one, though.
Okay.
Who identifies, specifies, and creates the documentation issues that go in the sprint?
The team does. The team works together to do sprint planning and decides what work the overall team can do based on their capacity and based on what is prioritized in the backlog. And I'll get into that a little bit more and a little bit later as far as doc-only tasks as well and user stories.
All right, great. Thanks.
Okay. So another thing to consider, and this is one of the pitfalls or possible pitfalls of Agile, you really need to think about the way you write. So when you're working with your team on your user stories, you've got to make sure that the user stories are actually about the user. This not only helps the user and make sure that the team is actually developing things that help the user versus just developing things because they think it's cool or they think the product manager wants it, but they don't have any customer verification. It also helps us as writers because it sets up quite a bit of good source information for our documentation. So one thing that I suggest is working with your team to write problem statements and acceptance criteria for the user stories that actually focus on solving user pain points. And then the acceptance criteria will help the team understand how users are going to know that that problem is fixed. So that way the entire team knows what you're building and why, what customer pain points that you're solving, and then what the expected behavior is in the product once you fix the problem. So then you can use those problem statements and acceptance criteria to be your main source for writing the doc. And all of the writing that you're doing and the digging the information out of the SME's brains that you're doing and trying to figure out why you're building a product which should take less time. And then the reviewing the doc will also take less time because everybody has tuned into those problem statements and acceptance criteria beforehand. One thing about Agile and the way that it's structured, because of the user stories, even if the user stories are focused on the user, if you're not careful, you can find yourself documenting feature after feature after feature and not tying it back to user goals. So it's important that you have an overall arching view of where you're trying to go with the story you're telling in your documentation, because if you don't have that, then you can get stuck in this feature type of writing, and before you know it, you're documenting a UI and not the product. I'm sorry, the UI and not the way the product helps you do your job. So remember that your content comes first and then your process comes second. And one way to actually work on that is through the InfoDev only user stories that you can track alongside the user stories that include dev, testing, and doc. It's important to have that information shown in the Agile tracking tool as well, so you don't lose track of your higher level stuff of where your story is going in your content, as well as making your team aware that you are working on other things besides just those few user stories that the entire team is working on. So ensure that you don't let your Agile process and the way that you that structure works with user stories overwhelm the overall picture you're trying to paint. So one way to look at that is capacity. This is especially important when you are working on multiple Agile projects. Almost everyone I talk to about working in an Agile environment is assigned to multiple projects. In an ideal world, we would have writers dedicated to particular projects, and you wouldn't have to go back and forth. But I don't see many people that have that luxury, unfortunately. So it's really important that you plan your capacity across your projects. Otherwise, you'll end up overbooking yourself and not completing your sprint work and holding up user stories, and then one or more of your teams will be upset with you. So we actually use a spreadsheet similar to the one shown here when we're planning for multiple projects, because there's various things you have to take into account when you're planning your capacity. Look at previous sprint estimates that you've done. You know, if you've been working within a team and working on a particular doc set for a while, you can start to kind of get a rhythm of how much you can complete for a particular project in a particular sprint length. Make sure that you include any vacation time you have coming up or non-sprint responsibilities, things like planning meetings, customer support, backlog grooming, retrospectives, any of those things that will take away from the time that you have to actually work on a particular project. You have to allow time for that. So we typically estimate approximately 20 to 25% of our time for that, what I call overhead tasks. So we book, in an 8-hour workday, we book 6 hours worth of work. So in any given week, a writer will have 30 hours of work, 30 hours of capacity for all the work that they do. If they're working on 2 projects and are allocated 50-50 on those, that means 15 hours a week for each project. Another thing to consider when you're doing this is that development and testing, or development must be done. Let's say you're doing a 4-week sprint. Development must be done about 3 weeks in, so that whatever the tasks are for testing and documentation for a particular user story, they must have some time to actually wrap those up. So if development goes all the way to the last day of a 4-week sprint, then anything you have outstanding that you've been waiting on a build for example, it's going to push the user story into the next sprint if you don't have that little bit of buffer time. And that is a training that you must go through with your team to kind of fall into that rhythm and get used to that. It's hard sometimes for development to get to where they can only take 3 of the 4 weeks out of the sprint, so that so that testing and doc can finish. But as you work together more as a team, the more likely it is that you're able to get to that, because your capacity is going to diminish as the sprint goes on. Obviously, we've been in situations where we'll get to the last week of the sprint, and about the 3rd day of that week, we don't have anything from dev yet. We start getting nervous, and we're like, hey, we need you to, get us a build for this feature in this user story, and they'll say, but you've got 20 hours of capacity. No, we had 20 hours of capacity at the beginning of the sprint, and that has gone on. That has gone away as time has gone on. So make sure you remember that. And then, as I mentioned before, tracking your doc-only tasks and user stories in the same place as you track your work where you have tasks in the user stories with dev and test is a really good way to make sure you don't overbook yourself within the writing team, and to make sure that your team is aware of the things you are working on, like, for example, production tasks, anything that you have to do as far as documentation rework or restructuring, fixing doc bugs, those tasks that tend to be doc only that don't necessarily fit with a user story that dev and test are working in as well. So just the lesson to learn here is that your capacity planning can make you or break you, especially if you're working on multiple projects. As you do this more and more, you get more of a sense of being able to know your capacity without perhaps using a spreadsheet where you write it all down. But I highly encourage people to use the spreadsheet or some sort of system where they can actually put it all in front of them and see it across multiple projects as they're learning. Especially if you're a lead on a project and working with multiple writers, it's also good to map out the spreadsheet for all of the writers on a particular project so that you don't overbook the team or underbook the team. Underbooking is just as bad as overbooking when you have a lot of work going on. But it's important that the team, the writer not take on too much and overbook themselves, but the team themselves, the project team, do capacity planning as a team also. If you have a user story that is going to take more doc time than it does dev or test, and you cannot fit it into the sprint, it should not be pulled into the sprint, or you won't be able to finish the user story by the end. So there are some ways that you can work on different projects and different teams and still be able to manage your workload. As you guys know, if you are working in an Agile environment, one of the perceived disadvantages of this particular type of development methodology is the increased number of meetings. While that's great for improved communication, it's especially difficult if you're working on multiple projects and you have daily stand-up meetings, for example, for 2 or 3 projects. Before you know it, you're in meetings all the time and can't get your work done as much, or don't have as much time to get your work done. So there's some different things that you can do as far as once you have your capacity figured out, how to spread your workload some. So you can work with your leader manager, and if there's multiple writers on a team, have split up the stand-up meetings, have you attend some, have the other writer attend some. You could look at going to meetings that are only about your highest priority project. For example, if you're near the end of a release for one project and just starting another project, maybe you kind of back off of the one that's just starting for a couple weeks until you get the higher priority one out, and can more easily balance those. We have a number of teams that have their status meetings online in some sort of collaboration tool, such as Slack or Basecamp or anything like that, and then they record that. So if you happen to miss a stand-up meeting, you can go back and check those records and then send your status in ahead of time so that it's recorded, so you don't have to physically be at every meeting. And then one of the most important parts of this is making sure that you are visible and have a presence on your team so that they don't forget you when you aren't there. There will be times that you have to miss a stand-up or miss a particular meeting because you have to go to another project's stand-up or different kind of meeting. If you are not an active and visible and vocal member of your team, it's going to be a lot easier for them to forget that they need to tell you something if you aren't there. Then if you're constantly there, they know what you need for updating or improving the doc, and they'll go, oh, you know what, Alyssa wasn't here today, but I know that this will affect that chapter she just wrote on blah, 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 so I better let her know. And if you're not vocal and you don't ever say anything in your normal meetings and you're not there, they're not going to remember to tell you that stuff. So it's to your advantage that you do that. Finally, I want to talk about potentially shippable documentation. So you hear a lot in Agile about potentially shippable doc. What does that mean? At the end of a sprint, you should have potentially shippable product, which of course leads to also potentially shippable doc. So this is one of the biggest misconceptions I hear, that people are constantly saying, we cannot, as a technical writer, I cannot be successful in Agile because at the end of a sprint, I can't have my doc ready to ship. I have to, run my PDF, or I have to send it through my help conversion tool, and I have to do all these extra things that nobody's going to wait on me for because otherwise the doc's not ready. What potentially shippable means is potentially shippable for the part of the product that was developed in that sprint. So what that means for doc is that the documentation for the user stories in that sprint is complete and shippable. Now, complete does not have to mean highly polished, part of the overall book, converted to help, et cetera, et cetera. It means that if I had to ship some doc for this feature in a text file, but it's complete and accurate, I can do that. It does not mean I have to have it authored in structured FrameMaker, published to XML, localized, et cetera, et cetera. So keep that in mind because they need the documentation, they need that content to be able to use the feature. They don't need the entire doc set at the end of each sprint. It also means that the UI review for the user stories in that sprint are complete and any changes that you have are implemented. The entire book and help system are not going to be complete, most likely, and probably not going to be shippable until you have some info dev only or documentation only user stories complete in that last sprint. And that's going to be your production process that you're running through, creating your release notes, making sure that your help is converted. All of that stuff that comes at the end of a release does not have to happen at the end of every sprint. Potentially shippable doc also means that any concepts, procedures, and references necessary for that story are done. So the documentation review that you've done within the sprint with your SME that we discussed earlier in lesson number 1, that's your acceptance test for that documentation, that piece of documentation. So that's yet another reason to have time for that documentation review in the sprint, so that you can have your chunk of potentially shippable doc at the end of a sprint because it has already been reviewed, it has been verified as technically accurate, and that you are not handing a customer a piece of doc that hasn't been verified or is not in a state that would make them successful. So the lesson from this is Don't focus on the shippable part of having your doc ready at the end of the sprint, but focus on potentially. And potentially, like we just went over, means there's part of it. The part that is appropriate for that sprint is what you need to focus on. So those are the top 5 lessons that I think you need to know about Agile and TechComm. I'm happy to take any other questions that we might have.
Well, we've got quite a few. They're stacking up a good bit. I want to make sure before we go real quick, show everybody what's coming up in the dojo. So type in your questions, any of the remaining ones, and then we'll work through the rest. We've got a mastermind session coming up. This is a conference call that is between confidential members of the TechComm community. If you're by yourself and you just need someone to talk things over with, these turned out to be really exciting and different. We've had a lot of good time doing it. This month we're talking tracking and data and doc metrics. So if that's what you're interested in, you can join down there at the link at the bottom. Our dojo next month is making EPUBs work with Scott Prentice from Leximation. So if you want to know how to do that, be sure to check the TC Dojo website. The links to register are at the bottom. All right, so here are the questions. Oh, there's so many. So exciting. Do you put doc-only stuff in separate user stories?
Yes, we do. If it's doc only and not in any way related to what dev and test are doing, we do create our own user stories within the same sprint so people are aware of what we're doing.
All right. And there's a question about links and contact info. If you join the mailing list that's right there, the ePearl, you'll get notified for everything. Everything else is at tcdojo.org. All right, next question. Have you successfully pushed back if you feel dev and test fit but not doc fit in the sprint?
Yes, we have. A lot of that is going to depend on your team. The way that I typically work with dev and tell them how I would like the writers to work within those teams is to make sure that the user stories include coding, testing, and documentation. Now, like I said, it depends on the maturity of the team. It depends on, frankly, sometimes the maturity of the people on the team. But in many, many cases, in the majority of our teams, we do hold back user stories or break up user stories to ensure that we can get all 3 parts of that done before we call a user story complete.
All right. Here's one. For those of us on multiple teams with multiple projects, how do you compensate for the lack of written specs or details that occur during the stand-ups?
That's a good question. So again, that's going to depend on your team. Often, if you can get requirements from your product owners documented, we can start with requirements. So kind of what I would call mini specs. And that's one reason I said it's so essential that you get those builds from your dev teams earlier in the sprint, because that's what you're basing your writing on, right? You're going to have that build, you're going to install that build, you're going to look at the product yourself because you don't have the specs and see how it's implemented within the product. You're going to be up a creek without a paddle if you have dev going all the way to the end of the sprint and you don't get your builds in time to be able to do that and then write accordingly. One thing that we have tried to do is, because we have the writers involved in the backlog grooming meetings as well as the release and sprint planning meetings, the more they know up front about what the features are of the release, the themes of the release, et cetera, they can start writing conceptual information early. And then once they get those builds a little bit later, they can actually then take on the work for documenting the associated procedures. But we try to write the conceptual information in the background, best practices, examples, etc., as early as possible, because if the writer is actually an equal member of the team and involved in those upfront meetings, they should have enough information to be able to do that and then fit the procedure information in towards later on in the sprint.
So there's a question that follows up, but I'm thinking you've kind of already given us the answer. It sounds like you don't like to see documentation development lagging by a sprint.
Absolutely, yes. I very vehemently argue against doing that, mainly because, well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it does not treat TechComm as an equal member of the team. It says, oh, well, coding and testing is important, but the documentation is no big deal if it's not done. Also, it puts us perpetually behind. If we're behind a sprint, it might be okay kind of mid-release, but when you get towards the end and dev and test is all done with their stuff and ready to move on to another release, you're already behind because you're still wrapping up a previous release, and it does not make for good teamwork, and it also contributes to burnout on the writer's part.
So I'm thinking it's a similar answer for this next question, which, what about short sprints, 1 or 2 week sprints? Sounds like those are not taking into account that buffer space.
Yeah, the problem with it depends on what kind of product you're putting out. If you're putting out something in the cloud or online where you can continually update every week or two, I've never heard of anybody doing 1 week sprints. I think that would be very difficult. 2 week are pretty difficult too. But if you're doing stuff like that, then hopefully your process is down enough and you're making much smaller changes to be able to do a 2 week sprint. We work on enterprise software, which is kind of still a little lethargic, a little heavy, usually client side. It's not typically browser based or in the cloud. So we have a little more room to do a little bit longer sprints. Most of our teams do 3 week sprints, and it can be a struggle if your development teams aren't trained in that way. But depending on how you're actually releasing that product to the cloud, I'm hoping that your changes are smaller and it's more accommodating to getting dev done even a week and a half into a 2 week sprint, so you have a couple days to make those minor changes.
Excellent. All right, so let's see. I think here's one. How do you handle tech review when dev is not using Agile, but Doc and QA are? Interesting question.
Wow. First of all, wow. I'm not really sure how testing and Doc are doing Agile, but dev is not. I would not consider that an Agile team. It might be that you're using Agile principles for the way that you're testing and documenting. If you want to give me more information about your particular scenario, maybe I could help. You can shoot me an email or a tweet, and I'd be happy to talk with you about that offline.
All right, let me switch back to you briefly so we can see your email. So show your screen again.
Okay.
There we go. I know you answer Twitter, so that's why I always have that on there. All right, let's see. We've got 1 or 2 questions left, and then we'll wrap up. One is really more of a comment. We got the DoD and our development process changed to indicate that the sprint isn't done without the doc stories being done. That sounds like it's a general.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's the way to do it. So for those of you that don't know, DoD is definition of done. So making sure that, when I was talking about done versus done, there is no done. Done should mean, like what this participant said, it shouldn't say it's not done until the doc is done as well. So that's great.
All right, let's see. I think I've got everything. And they said good questions, good answers. Absolutely. So much fun. Thank you for you.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next month. Be sure to come to tcdojo.org and see what's coming up. Thanks, Alyssa. That was fabulous.
Right. Bye.
Bye.